Welcome to the Prospective Doctor podcast, brought to you by Med School Coach. Each week we cover topics related to the pre-med journey to medical school and beyond. From the MCAT to completing your application and from starting medical school to choosing a specialty, our podcast will provide essential information for anyone contemplating a career in medicine.
Hey everyone, I know that you are all getting really excited about being able to submit your application to medical school coming up really soon here. AMCAS opens in just a couple days, and TMDSAS and AOCOMAS have already opened. So this is definitely an exciting time, very anxiety-provoking for some, but you will feel very good once you hit submit on that application. One thing I wanted to talk about today is building your school list. So lots of times people have a lot of anxiety about the school list, and in a way, rightfully so. The school list really is where you're going to kind of place your odds in a way. You're kind of trying to put a bet on which schools you're going to be most competitive at. And it's an important part of your application. It really is, because if you don't put the right schools and you're not applying correctly, then you're just sending an application out there and you may not actually be putting the odds in your favor. So we're going to mostly talk about allopathic schools today, U.S. allopathic schools. There's over 150 U.S. allopathic schools. So how do you go about narrowing down how many schools you want to apply to? So let's break it down. Number one, first off, let's talk about how many schools to apply to. Not where, how many. So this is a really important question that we get asked all the time. And unfortunately, there's no magic number on number of schools equals success. It's really a function of how competitive you are as an applicant. So for more competitive applicants, and what I mean by competitiveness is really we're going to consider mostly numbers. So we're talking at least a 515 plus MCAT, 3.8 plus GPA are some of the most competitive applicants out there. For some of those applicants that are very competitive, have those higher GPAs and higher MCATs, you could probably apply to around 25 schools, because just your stats alone, obviously you need to take in consideration the competitiveness of the rest of your application, like your extracurricular activities and things like that. But just looking at stats alone, you'll have a pretty good chance of getting in with applying to about 25 schools. For the applicants that are more average on their MCAT score and GPA, so around like a 5.10 and maybe about a 3.7 or so GPA and below, you want to increase the number of schools that you're going to apply to. I usually recommend for these applicants applying to anywhere from 30 to 40 schools. And I get a really important question here is some people say, well, why can't I just apply to 60 or 70 or 80? Why not apply to all of them and just cast a wide net as much as possible? And the reason being is that, one, it's expensive to apply to all these schools. Each application that you submit through your primary application to a school costs money. And then every school, almost every school will send you a secondary application where you're going to have to pay anywhere between $50 to $100 and write essays to that school to complete the secondary application. So it is expensive. And number two, it is super time consuming. Once you start getting those secondaries, you're going to have to be writing a ton. And if you apply to 80 schools, it likely is just not going to be feasible to financially afford that and also be able to put the time and effort necessary into those secondary applications. It's very, very unlikely that people are going to do well on those secondaries if you have 80 plus schools to apply to. So I think 30 to 40 is a really good range of schools to apply to for some of those average applicants and lower than average applicants as well. So that talks about the number of schools to apply to. So first off, where? Let's start breaking that down. So number two is where. And the first thing you want to consider is your state of residence. So most schools, at least public schools, highly favor their in-state applicants. And the reason being is that they want to produce doctors that will hopefully stay in the state that medical school is in and practice and contribute to the healthcare of that state. Private schools not so much. They usually don't favor in-state applicants as much, but public schools, where usually they receive some state fundings, they really want in-state students. So number 2 is where to apply. Apply to all of your in-state schools, in-state public schools. There's a couple caveats here. Some people ask me, well, what about if I'm a California resident and University of California, San Francisco? I mean, they're super competitive. Their stats are really high. Should I apply there? And I usually say it depends on your exact stats. If you have a 504 MCAT and a 3.2 GPA, probably not worth an application there. But if you have a 512 MCAT and a 3.8 GPA and you're kind of a little bit over the average competitiveness, it's probably worth an application. I think also it depends on where you live geographically. For instance, if you are from the Bay Area and you'd really like to stay there, still probably worth an application to UCSF, even though they're really competitive. So where to apply? Apply to all your in-state public schools. Number 3, where to apply continued? Apply to schools that are in your MCAT and GPA range. So all of the MCAT and GPA median scores for each school is available on the MSAR. And these are median. So this is kind of the middle of the road MCAT score and GPA that the school accepts. So you have to remember, and the MSAR even shows it, that they accept higher than this and they accept lower than this. So keep your MCAT and GPA in the range of their median acceptances. So what I mean by that exactly is, let's say a school says their median MCAT is a 510 and their median GPA is a 3.7. So if you're anywhere between like a 507 to 513 or so and a GPA of like a 3.5 to 4.0, you're competitive for that school. They're in your range. So even if you're a little bit lower, then you're good. If you're a little bit higher, then that is even more encouraging. An important note here, and some people have expressed some concerns about this, is applying to safety schools. And what most people mean is that they are very, very competitive for a school. So let's say they are super competitive for like a top tier school like Harvard. They have the stats and the GPA that are right along theirs, and maybe they're going to apply to Creighton, which is lower than Harvard's stats. And they will call this a safety school. I have problems with this term because there's really no safety schools when it comes to applying to medical school. It is inherently competitive at every school. So it's really not a safety school. It's more of you are over competitive for this school. Your stats are higher than theirs, but you should still include a variety of these in your school selection. Even if you're competitive for the most top tier schools, don't put all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak. Don't only apply to those top tier schools. Try to spread your application around. We'll talk more about that in just a second. Some people also say, well, if you have a 520 MCAT and you're applying to a place like Florida State University and they only have a 507, some people can say, well, Florida State's going to say that you are not going to go there if you got accepted because, this is like a backup school. They can see that you're probably considering this a backup school. I think that is true in part. You have to be a little bit careful that you don't want to only put these lower tier schools when you're really competitive. But if you're able to provide a convincing argument in your secondary application of why you want to go there, then they should give you a fair shot. So example, if that 520 MCAT said, I really want to go to Florida State because my family lives there, I'm from the area, I've spent some time shadowing there, blah, 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 things like that, and really showing their connection, then Florida State's more likely to offer that applicant an acceptance, even if their scores are much higher than their medians. So number 4, let's talk about how many schools to apply to in different tiers. So there's not a perfect way to break down different tiers of medical schools. If you look at US News and World Report, they'll break down the top medical schools by the amount of research funding they receive and the primary care aspects at that medical school. However, really for an applicant's sense of how good a school is, you can look at those, but then you also kind of group the tiers of the school based on their competitiveness. The higher tier schools are inherently more competitive than some of the lower tier schools. So depending on where you stand with your competitiveness, is if you are very, very competitive, you want to apply to some top tier schools. And then also, as I mentioned previously, kind of sprinkle your application into some of the mid and lower tier schools as well. And if you're kind of middle or average applicant, you probably want to primarily apply to those middle tier and lower tier schools, maybe put in a couple of top tier, high tier dream schools that you really would just love to attend. But really, you want to make sure that you are putting the majority of your applications to schools where you're most competitiveness. So again, look at your in-state schools, apply to those, and then start applying to out-of-state private schools based on how competitive you are and their stats. And that leads me to number 5 on how to determine which schools to apply to. We mentioned earlier about the demographical factors of being an in-state resident. Well, what about those people that are out-of-state residents? Let's take Colorado, for instance. Let's say you're a Colorado resident. Well, you only have one in-state school at all, and that's one public school, that's University of Colorado. So obviously, like as we said, you'd want to apply to University of Colorado, but then the majority of your applications are going to be outside of Colorado. So how do you start choosing those schools? Well, we talked about putting in your competitiveness and considering that, but the other factor you want to consider is how many out-of-state residents or applicants they accept. So let's take a couple examples. Let's say Creighton again. Creighton actually accepts 94% out-of-state students. So that would be a great one to apply to if you are competitive with their stats, because they're saying that 94% of their class comes from out of state. That means that as an out-of-state applicant, you have a pretty good shot of getting accepted. Whereas let's look at somebody else. Let's say this applicant from Colorado is looking to apply to the University of South Alabama. Well, they only accept 7% out of state. That is going to be a pretty hard to get into that South Alabama school because they accept so few out-of-state students. There's no perfect cutoff for this number on how many out-of-state students they accept, but obviously you want this to be higher. Higher the better. That means that greater the chance you'd get accepted if you're not an in-state resident for that school. I usually try to set this to above about 40% or 50% of out-of-state students the school accepts, with the caveat of being if you have a tie to that state. So let's say that this student is from currently in Colorado, but he has family in South Alabama and that's where he's originally from. He could write about that in his secondary application and show that linkage to Alabama and would have a greater chance of getting accepted. So if you have a specific tie to that school, then it may be very helpful for you to get in, even if they don't accept a ton of out-of-state students. But it's just an important consideration to take into account when you're choosing your school list. One final note that I will talk about, I know that I mentioned that I would talk mostly about U.S. allopathic schools. Definitely consider DO schools. I usually recommend DO schools if you're kind of at or below the averages for U.S. allopathic schools. So if you're anywhere below that 510-ish, 3.7 mark, then you should consider osteopathic schools as well. And then the same kind of thing goes for here, except osteopathic schools are kind of a little bit more similar on their average MCATs and GPAs. However, you do want to look at the amount of out-of-state applicants that they look at. You do want to look at the amount of out-of-state applicants that they accept. So hopefully this is helpful for everybody out there. It's a very quick overview of how to choose your school list. There are some other factors that go into it that people do talk about like how many students they interview, how big is their class size. And I do think those are relevant as well in some cases, but this is kind of overview on how to go about assembling that school list. And again, there's other factors that are taken into consideration as far as your extracurricular activities and how competitive you are there. But again, I wanted just to provide some guidance on how to start going about building that school list. One great tool that we have on perspectivedoctor.com is a school list creator where you actually put in the breakdown of your MCAT score, your GPA, your state of residence, your ethnicity, and you'll actually get a list of schools where you're most competitive at. And it's going to also consider that out-of-state aspect that we talked about, and then tell you which schools you're most competitive at based on that GPA and MCAT. So check out that tool. It is super helpful. It's updated with the most recent MSAR data. So that's at perspectivedoctor.com. Check that out. Hopefully you guys learned a little something here, and definitely feel free to reach out to us if you need help compiling that school list.
Our mission is to inspire, encourage, and inform students as you journey through a rigorous and intricate process of achieving your dreams in medicine. Visit us at prospectivedoctor.com and medschoolcoach.com for more essential resources in your medical school journey and beyond.